Hi everybody, welcome to this week's Who's Who Storytime. And this week's Storytime, I will admit, it's gonna be different. It's gonna be a little weird. That is because I am gonna read a book that I'm not a fan of, a book that I wouldn't recommend reading. And you might be at home wondering, Miss Olivia, why are you doing this? Why are you doing a story time with a book that you don't even like? That is a great question. We're gonna read this book and we're gonna work through it together. We're gonna critique it. You at home, as a young reader, you have the ability to critique any work you come across. You have that power. And critique is sometimes a word that gets a negative connotation, which people might consider it like a bad word, but it's not. It's not negative at all. It's really just a form of questioning. You're questioning the author, you're questioning the author's intent, which is a question of why did the author write this? That's a great question to ask. You're questioning what groups of people were left out of the book. When you're reading a nonfiction book about history or a historical moment or about a group of people or a person, of course the author can't cover everything. But sometimes you read a book like the one we're reading today and there's just a gaping hole. There's something missing. And so you critique it, you research it, and you question it. And that's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna read, question, and critique this book together. I chose this book because on August 26th, this Wednesday, it is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted white women the right to vote in the United States in presidential elections. And the book we're reading today is about Esther Morris, who was actually one of the first women to vote in the country in 1869. So the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, so almost 50 years previous, a woman cast a ballot in an election. And let's get into critiquing the book. First, let me tell you the title of the book. It's a book called I Could Do That. Esther Morris Gets Women the Vote. It was written by Linda Arms White and it was illustrated by Nancy Carpenter. So it's about Esther Morris getting women the right to vote. And we're gonna look at the back of the book because that's where we're gonna start our critique. Now, over the past few weeks of Who's Who, I explain about author's notes and bibliographies and small biographies at the back of books. And those are super important to read in nonfiction books because you wanna know how the author and what the author researched to write the book. So we're gonna look at that today. So this only has one page of information and it's an author's note that's not a biography and some resources. So resources, super important. We're glad that the author included those. But this author's note's a little weird. So I'm gonna read a part of it. It says, while many historians believe that the story of her Tea Party, of Esther Morris's Tea Party, is true, as Captain H.G. Nickerson, one of her candidates, reported some years later, other historians question whether it really happened. All, however, agree that Esther was instrumental in gaining women's suffrage in the Wyoming territory. So already I'm having some questions. If some historians don't believe that this story is true, what research did the author do further? It's a little too brief for me. She didn't really detail what research proved this story to be true. So let's read it. Let's read the book. Okay. In 1820, 6-year-old Esther McQuigg studied her mother making tea. I could do that, she said. Make tea? Asked Mama. The older girls do that. But I want to learn, said Esther, and she did. She pumped water into the kettle and set it on the wood stove to boil. She scooped tea leaves into the teapot, then poured steaming water over them. Esther strained the tea into cups, one for her mother and one for herself. As they sat near the windows of their New York house, Esther saw men riding by in their best suits, some carrying flags. Where are those men going, Mama? Asked Esther. They are going to vote for the next president of the United States. Will Papa vote? Yes, Papa always votes. Will you vote, Mama? No, dear, only men can vote. When Esther was 8, she watched her mother sew a fine seam. The needle pulled thread in and out, tracking tiny, even stitches across the fabric. Esther felt her hands mimicking her mother's. I could do that, she said, and she did. She made clothes for her doll from scraps, and when her stitches became neat and straight, she sewed a shirt for her papa. When Esther was 11, her mother died, and for the first time, she saw her father cry. He gathered his 11 children together. I don't know what we'll do without your mama, he said. I'm depending on each of you to be brave and to take care of one another. Esther, 8th of the 11, cried too. But then she said, I can do that, Papa. And she did. When Esther was 19, 6 feet tall, and on her own, she earned a living making dresses with leg of mutton sleeves for society ladies. When the ladies wanted hats to match the dresses, Esther designed and made those too. Soon, she thought of opening a millinery shop. You are much too young to run a business, she was told. I don't see why, was Esther's reply. And with that, she opened a hat shop in Oswego, New York. Esther started attending abolitionist meetings at her church, but a throng of people who believed in the right to own slaves threatened to stop the meetings even if they had to tear down the Baptist church where they were held. You can't do that, Esther said. I'll stop anyone who tries. When Esther was 28, she married Artemis Slack, and a few years later had a son they called Archie. But when Artemis died in an accident, Esther made a big decision. I'm moving to Illinois, she told her friends. I'll claim the land Artemis owned there and raise our son. You can't do that, her friends cried. Illinois is the very edge of civilization. It's full of dangerous people and wild animals. Yes, she said, I can. And that was that. In Illinois, she fought a long and hard claim to Artemis's land, but was denied her inheritance because she was female. So Esther opened another hat shop. Esther met and married John Morris, a merchant and immigrant from Poland, and in 1851, she gave birth to twin boys, Edward and Robert. But John had a hard time making a living, so while Esther raised the children, cooked the meals, and washed the clothes, she helped earn the money too. When Esther was 46, she went with John to the presidential election polls and watched through the window while he voted. You know, she told him when he came out, I could do that. Politics is the business of men, my dear, he said. Said Esther. It's our country too. When war broke out between the northern and southern states, Esther was proud that Archie joined the victorious fight of the North to end slavery. Soon after, an amendment to the Constitution granted Black men all rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. When Esther heard Susan B. Anthony speaking out about women's rights, Esther began to hope that someday women might have the vote too. In 1869, when Esther was 55, she and her 18-year-old sons moved to the newly formed Wyoming territory where John and Archie, who'd gone there the year before, waited. Esther and the boys traveled by train across miles of prairie, then by stagecoach over rocky hills to South Pass City, a dusty, hurriedly built town where gold had been found. Most of the 2,000 people who lived there were rowdy young men. They worked in the mines by day and drank in the saloons at night. The Morrises moved their belongings into a small log cabin, and South Pass City became a home. John ran a saloon, Archie bought a printing press and started a newspaper. Esther opened another hat shop. But with 6 men to every woman, there was always a need for someone to nurse the sick and wounded, sew clothes, help deliver babies, and give motherly advice to the few young women in town. I could do that, Esther said, and she did. One day, Esther read a proclamation tacked to a wall. All male citizens 21 and older are called to vote in the first territorial elections. Esther looked around at the disorderly young men. It's time I did that. When Esther's sons watched her march toward home, they knew it was more likely that things were about to change than the things that would stay the same. Esther invited the 2 men running for the territorial legislature to her house to speak to the citizens. Then she sent out invitations to the most influential people in the territory. Come for tea and talk to the candidates. She scrubbed her tiny home from top to bottom, washed the curtains, and ironed her best dress. When the candidates and guests arrived, Esther served them tea. One thing I like about Wyoming, she said, is how everyone is important. It takes all of us to run the town, women as well as men. Yes, her guests agreed. And it's a place where people aren't afraid to try new things. Her guests agreed again. Esther smiled. She turned to the candidates. Then, would you, if elected, introduce a bill in the legislature that would allow women the right to vote? Suddenly, in that tiny room full of people, not a sound was heard. Finally, Colonel William Bright spoke. Mrs. Morris, my wife would like to vote too. She is intelligent and well educated. Truth be told, she would be a more informed voter than I. If I am elected, I will introduce that bill. Not wanting to be outdone, the other candidate, Herman Nickerson, also agreed. Applause broke out in that tiny cabin, and Esther dropped to her chair. Thank you, she said. People warned her that once the bill was introduced, the men of the legislature would have to approve it, and the governor would have to sign it. This had never happened anywhere. Why did she think it could happen here? But Esther had seen that things that were not likely to happen happened every day. She wrote letters and visited legislators to make sure that this bill would happen too. And it did. On December 10th, 1869, Governor John Campbell signed this bill into law. Wyoming women get the vote. Women across the country rejoice for the women of Wyoming. Yee-haw! Yippee! Hurrah! Hurrah! But some people didn't like it. Only 8 days later, Judge James Stillman, the county's justice of the peace, turned in his resignation. He refused to administer justice in a place where women helped make the laws. Word went out that a new justice of the peace was needed. Esther's boys turned to her. Mama, you could do that, they said. And so she applied. Archie, then clerk of the court, proudly swore his mother in, making Judge Esther Morris the first woman in the country to hold public office. But Judge Stillman refused to turn over the office court docket to Esther. Never mind, she said. Archie, will you please go to the mercantile and buy me a ledger? I'll start my own docket. And of course, she did. On September 6th, 1870, 1 year after her tea party, Judge Esther Morris put on her best dress and walked with her husband John and her sons down the dusty street to the polling place. She would be one of a thousand Wyoming women voting that day, the first ever given the right permanently by a governing body in the United States. As they walked, John, who still didn't think women should vote, tried to coach her on which candidates and issues to vote for. Esther held up her hand. I can do this, she said. And so she did. Okay, so now let's look back at the book, because I have some questions, and maybe you do too. One of my questions is this line on this page in the beginning of the book when Esther tells her friends that she's going to move to Illinois, and her friends say, Illinois is the very edge of civilization. It's full of dangerous people and wild animals. Who are the dangerous people in Illinois? Because that is a very subtle way of being racist. We'll just call it what it is. That's a subtle way of being racist. The wild people they're referring to are the indigenous populations of Illinois at the time. So that's a critique I have. That's a question I have. I also have a question about this page, which is about the Civil War and Susan B. Anthony. And the author wrote, soon after, an amendment to the Constitution granted Black men all rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. And then she says that Susan B. Anthony talked about women's rights, and someday women might get that vote too. But if you look at the picture, who's in that picture? It's Susan B. Anthony and Esther Morris and white women. When we say women, we really mean, the author really means white women. Susan B. Anthony and Esther Morris were fighting for white women. So we have to be a little bit more specific with our language. That's another critique I have. Another one is when Esther moves to the Wyoming territory. It's a newly founded Wyoming territory. And we all know that this land was occupied by different residents before white people moved in. And the author chose to exclude that group. So that's the question I have. What population of people did the author exclude from the narrative? And I feel, this is an I statement, I feel that when authors write about this time period of moving westward, of colonialists moving into territories, they have to include the people who were forcibly moved out. And in this case, it would have been the Shoshone tribe of Wyoming, of eastern Wyoming. That's who would have been here and been forced to move out. And the author did not include that. And they did not include that in their author's note. So that's another question I have. My final question I'm gonna say today is, if you remember a few weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, we read a book where the back of the book had all of these source quotes. So they had quotes that were specifically from things. They were from movies, they were from interviews, they were from clips that the author had watched and included in the book. There is a lot of dialogue in this book, and there is no source about what this dialogue, where this dialogue came from. And that is a question you as a reader have to ask yourself. How does the author know all of this? How does the author know what the people are thinking, know what the people are saying? This is a historical book. What sources did they use? They have to include that. Otherwise, you kind of believe that they made it up. And if they made it up, is it nonfiction? That's a question we have to ask. Now, I'm gonna flip to the back of the book. And in the back of the book, of course, we have the author biography and the illustrator biography. And one of the questions I asked at the beginning is, what is the author's intent and purpose in making this book? So if you read Linda Arms White, if you read her biography, she is from Wyoming, and she was very, very inspired by Esther Morris growing up. And she visited South Pass City, where Esther Morris lived, and became the Justice of the Peace. We know for a fact that Esther Morris was the first woman to hold public office, but we don't know if that Tea Party took place. We don't know if she advocated for white women to get the right to vote. We don't know any of that as fact, but we do know she was the first white woman to hold public office in the United States. So Linda Arms White, her biography is mostly about her being from Wyoming and feeling inspired to write this story. So you know her intent is to uplift Esther Morris, to make her seem like she's an advocate and a hero, and that's fine. That's a fine intent to do. But it's our job as readers to look at this book and ask, is Esther Morris a hero? On some part, she is. She's a catalyst for more people getting the right to vote. She was the first white woman to hold public office in the United States. Yeah, there's a lot of great things about Esther Morris, but this book does leave out a lot. And you as a reader have the power to question that. You as the reader have the power to raise your hand in class, at the library, wherever you're hearing books read to you, and say, this is missing something. What is it missing? You have that power. And I encourage you to do that with every book that's read to you. I encourage you to do that with every who's who. I might pick a book that I love and I'm a little biased and I might not see something that I want to question, but you might. And that's fine. You have to do that as a reader. You have all the power to do that. So this was a story about Esther Morris. And on Wednesday, we are going to have an exhibit out on the lawn, starting in the morning, to encourage your grown-ups to do early voting. And if you want to come by and learn more about different groups getting the right to vote, come and see our exhibit. We're also going to have a pop-up library right by the lawn where the exhibit is. You can't miss it. It's pretty big. On Wednesday at 3:30, and it'll go till 5:30 if you want to check out some books about suffragists, about suffragettes, about different groups getting the right to vote, about the 19th Amendment, all about how voting works. Maybe you have some questions about that. We're gonna have all those books for you available from 3:30 to 5:30, so stop on by, visit our exhibit, and check out some books. All right, thank you for coming to this Who's Who story time. I know it was a little different, but I love working through books. I love critiquing books. I love questioning books. It's one of my favorite things to do. So I hope to see you next week for another Who's Who story time. Bye.